than Death. It is on sale over there, so please do buy it and get it autographed before you leave. The book is based on an activist, I can call her an activist, Annalena, who worked and had her experience in the Somali Horn as a whole. I read the book last week, and I have to say I had a roller coaster of emotions. Initially, I was conflicted about Annalena and the work she did, or the work that she did in the first few chapters. She was a white privileged woman who lived at a time where that whiteness gave her privilege on the back of the colonial era. And because of that, she was able to do some things that people cannot do now, like get awarded a contract to do experimental medical treatments for Somali nomads who were vulnerable and had TB without any medical qualifications or medical background, so as an activist. But as I read, and despite her rejection of her own privilege, in her eyes, she was the same as the people she served. But obviously a privilege is perceived, it doesn't matter whether you accept it or not. But as I continued to read the subsequent chapters, I became not only more understanding, but appreciative of the work that she did, because on the whole, I felt like she did more good than, I felt like she did more good than all the INGOs, NGOs, and the institutions that were working in the Horn, who were tasked with doing the very work that she was able to. And sadly, although standards and ethics have changed, so I don't think now you can have an activist running around in any part of the world doing medical interventions without medical background, the NGOs, INGOs, and institutions still continue to act more like sideline observers who write lengthy reports for a data bank that we don't have access to. And when I say we, I mean people like me who they're writing about. And I think they continue to live a luxury life off the back of very poor, very vulnerable people, and this was her biggest contention. And she lived a very radical life, and I think when you combine her drive, her dedication to the Somali people that she worked with, and the love that she showed them, this made, I guess, it made me understand some of the drastic things that she did, because I saw the lengths that she was going to help the people that she perceived as her people. And I also saw some of the acceptance from some of the people that are still alive and the legacy that she leaves behind. And we will be meeting some of those people here tonight as well. So that's kind of my reflection on reading the book, Stronger Than Death. So my first question to Rachel is, we already know that you can buy the book here, I already said that. What motivated you to write this book, and have other readers and reviewers had the same kind of strong and contradictory reactions to who Annalena was and what she did? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And thank you for that. It's such a thoughtful, deep, reflective response to her story. It's complicated. And then add to the top of that this book is written by a white woman who was living in Africa. My husband was a professor there, and we were...
I didn't notice.
It's hard to tell, I know. the blonde hair gives it away. And so it is a complicated story, told by a complicated person. And to be honest, that was part of my draw to her story, because I like, even though it's hard, to wrestle with complicated things. Because I don't feel like personally or corporately we grow unless we're willing to have hard conversations. And so, okay, I'm gonna try to have a hard conversation about what Annalena did. And there was things that she did that I disagreed with and that I also really struggled with. I didn't know about them until I started doing the research. But then also watching how she changed through her life and changed her opinion, changed her mind about things she had done, and then was humble enough to admit it, really struck a chord with me. I don't think very many of our leaders today would publicly say, I changed my mind about something and I'm gonna do it different going forward. And so that willingness on her part to say that, I felt like, okay, here's a person who is really a real person. She made mistakes, and she also was fully committed to what she was doing. So that was part of my draw to her story. Also, I felt a little bit of similarity. I lived very differently from her. We had different focuses, all kinds of things, and I never lived as radically as she did. But obviously, like I said, a foreign woman living in the Somali region. So I'll say my family moved to Somaliland in 2003. And that was where my life kind of intersected with hers. And so I was very curious about why she had stayed. She stayed in the Horn of Africa for 34 years. And I wanted to know what would help someone, what would motivate someone to stay that long. Because when I first encountered her, I had only been in the Horn of Africa. Well, I have never actually met her in person, but our lives collided after I had been there for less than a year. And so I wondered, what would it take to stay here longer than this? So that's a very initial part of how we met. Not met, but met intellectually.
No, that is very interesting. And I think one of the other things about the book is because it starts with her from, like, right when she was at Italy as a youngster, a teenager.
The first chapter, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the prologue is the end of her life,
Yeah.
and then it flashes back.
Yeah, so there's a flashback. So you kind of see her entire life, kind of her motivations, her uni, she was studying law, all the way to kind of like her death or when she's killed in Borome. I don't want to assume, I don't want to imply
Spoiler alert.
She was shot in Borome in Somaliland. And I think it is true because there are difference between when she's a young, passionate activist working in Wajir compared to when she's a lot older, matured activist working in Borome. And you can see it through, her actions, her decisions, and kind of just her entire attitude. And I guess nobody can say Rachel didn't confront all the kind of or difficult decisions that Annalena made, but also why she made them and the actions that she took. And everything from there are poor people in Italy, why didn't she work for them instead of going all the way to the Horn of Africa, to kind of why would she partake in cultural practices that now, and I guess in the last 20, 30 years, have become something that people campaign against, like for example FGM. So yeah, my other question for you is, how did you reconcile, I think this is connected, her work, her personal belief, or rather what is her personal belief? I was so conflicted throughout the story because initially, my initial thoughts were she's a missionary, going to spread Christianity. And then the more you read, she doesn't actually preach anything to anybody. In fact, she doesn't discuss religion at all. She practices very privately. And then, when she dies, she follows a different path, or she leaves a request to have something else done. I don't want to spoil the book for you guys. So I was kind of, at the end of the book, I was like, I don't know if you can say she's a missionary. So how do you reconcile her personal belief with her work, with her actions? Because that sometimes all of it seems to be in contradiction. And it was very jarring to read because as humans, we want to make neat little boxes. And then I'm like, that's a missionary from Italy who went to a country that they previously partly colonized, right? And that would have been very simplistic. Well, it would be untrue. It wouldn't be simplistic. It just simply would not be true. So how did you reconcile all of those things?
Yeah, well, there's all kinds of ideas about what she was. Was she a missionary? Was she a nun? Was she a spy? Was she a doctor? All these things, and there are documents that you can find that will say she was any of those things, and none of those are true. Probably the most common thing is that she was a nun. She was not a nun. She was single and she was Catholic. If it's okay, I think I'll start with some of her story to give people some background of what she did. So Annalena was born in a town in Italy in 1943. And in 1969, she moved to Kenya. She had a job there teaching. And so at Kenya, she felt like, this is fine, but it wasn't kind of hitting her where she felt the most called. She felt like she really wanted to go and work with the poor and the most needy. And so she took a trip to Wajir, Kenya. And Wajir, Kenya at that time, 1970, was a place where Kenyan teachers would actually pay bribes to avoid going to work there. They did not want to. And she just fell in love with the desert, essentially, and the Somalis that she met pretty quickly in Wajir. And so she requested to move there and to be a teacher again. And she had been trained in law, like you said. And so the Kenyan government said, yeah, sure, if you want to go there, go there. And so she did, and a few women, another woman, especially Maria Teresa, was a friend of hers from Italy, she joined her there. And they, over time, eventually, specifically what happened was the cholera epidemic hit the village, and that brought them into contact with the hospital, or the clinic that was there, and sick children, and so she started to see this medical need. And then, long story short, you have to read the book to get all the details, she ended up at the hospital, she met people with tuberculosis. And she learned that tuberculosis had, at that time, a fairly predictable treatment process, but it took 18 months, and it made people feel sick, and it was really hard to actually follow this treatment. And so, and also in Kenya, people weren't getting the treatment they needed. And so people with tuberculosis were sharing beds or sharing utensils, sharing cooking stuff with other patients, and it's very contagious. Actually, TB has killed one out of every 7 human beings who ever lived on the planet. So it's an extremely dangerous disease. And she then, like you said, she was not a medical doctor. She did get some tropical medicine training, but she was never a doctor, which is one of the valid critiques of her work. But she learned that TB treatment is more of a management process. If you have a doctor managing the medications and the pharmaceuticals, then she could manage the giving them out. And so, especially with Somali nomads, they were not willing to stay at a clinic for 18 months to get treatment. They wanted to be in the desert, they wanted to be with their animals, going to find water and pasture and all these things. And so there was just kind of a burgeoning research into TB of a short course therapy option that could take 6 to 9 months if it was, very strictly followed with particular medicine. So she started an experiment, like you said, with the UN funding and WHO in Wajir, where she brought nomads into, or invited them, she didn't bring them, but invited them to come, and they could build akals, their huts there. She established a mosque, she built a school, and so they could come with their animals and with their family, and they could have productive labor. She started some job skills training, and then she thought, if there's the right context of care, the people will stay. And so she oversaw their management of care, and that was what happened in Wajir. So that was where she started this tuberculosis process. And then, again, kind of skipping forward, in 1985, there was a massacre in Kenya. The Kenyan government instituted a massacre against a particular Somali clan, and they wanted to cover it up. They didn't want anyone to know about it, and she and her Somali partners, nurses, and people who worked at the hospital with her also refused to cover it up. So they were rescuing people from this massacre. She did not single-handedly stop it, which is one of the things people also have said about her. She did not stop it, but she tried to save people who had been wounded. And then she also buried people on her property in Wajir. And this was technically illegal from the government, and so she was kicked out of Kenya. And so from Kenya, she moved to Somalia. She moved to first Beledweyne and Mogadishu and Merka, where she continued doing tuberculosis treatment. And then things got too intense there, and lots of adventures and terrible things happened. And then eventually she moved to Somaliland, Borma, where that's where I encountered her. And then there she also established some deaf schools. So that's just an overview, maybe kind of long, but so to give you some context of what she was doing in the Horn. That didn't answer your question. I forgot what you asked, Stephen.
No, I think it's a very good overview, and she was very much larger than life. What do you want people to take away, or what's now, especially now that you've written the book, you've seen the different responses, what do you want us to take away from, getting her whole life in this book? So,
yeah, I think that one of the things she did really well is that she stayed a really long time. And like you said, a lot of INGOs, they kind of observe and they write reports, but they do not get deeply engaged with the people and with the culture. And she did. And also they don't stay a really long time. They might come in for 2 years for a project and then they leave. But she devoted her entire life to staying until she could see both the trajectory of her work and also her own personal growth. She had time to be transformed. Like you mentioned with FGM, she had some girls that were in her home in Wajir, and she actually brought in a midwife and circumcised them. And when I found out about that, I thought, what on earth? You were an aid worker. And I was on a train in Italy when I was doing the research for the project, when I read that in her own handwriting, and I dropped my notebook. And then later in her life, in Somaliland, she joined with a chef and with midwives in Somaliland to campaign against the practice and shared her own process. And so very few people who cross borders internationally in this kind of world of aid and development stay so long that they can watch their own personal transformation happen. And so I think that's one thing I would love people to take away. It takes a long time to learn something, to grow and to change and to actually embody and model that kind of change. I also think part of her legacy is that she demonstrated how to cross borders, religious borders. Like you said, she's kind of confusing. Cultural borders, racial borders, ability, all these things. Like, she was so focused on the person in front of her and not on herself, not on gaining glory for herself. She maybe wouldn't have even have wanted a book written about her. She was always shying away from publicity. And so I think that she models some ways of doing that are humble and really focused on the person in front of her. For example, this red goat, it's a Somali cloth. This was what she used to sleep on. She did not sleep on a bed. I sleep on a bed. When I lived in Djibouti for 20 years, in Somaliland for a year, and I always slept on a bed unless we were camping. But she would sleep on this because she wanted to identify, even with her physical body, with the people that she was there to help. And she didn't want to live above them, either physically or in any other kind of way. And so, that kind of extreme example, I don't expect people to follow, but I think we can learn from that a little bit. I think I can take a little bit more of a step toward being like the people that I'm trying to help, and learning from them as well. Yeah.
I guess I also found myself wondering, the next panel, Howard's on there, so we'll talk to Howard as one of the people who graduated from the deaf school. But for me, I think because I also partly work in the medical sector, I really struggled with kind of like her clinics, and the people that were being treated had nowhere to go after they left her. So even when I kind of thought, okay, she did a lot of help, a lot of those people were leaving her clinic and kind of walking into almost death traps of conflict and more diseases. So we know that she helped them in the clinic, but we don't know what happened to them after they left, and the chances are they probably didn't survive, or if they did, few of them survived intact. And there's a lot of death in the book. Even the people that she develops, proper relationship with, and they follow her to different clinics, inevitably they die. Overall, it was a very had very sad aspects where everybody you kind of develop a level of admiration for. You're like, what, a Somali person came through and they learned the TB protocol and whatnot, and then a couple of chapters later, they die of malaria or some other, in a random shootout or whatever. It was very traumatizing for me. So I think you have a different experience. I think the Western audience would have a complete different experience to somebody like me who's a diaspora Somali reading this, and then maybe that would also differ from a local person in Somaliland or Somalia reading the book now. And I think it's worth considering the difference in how people react to it and how people, what emotions people have reading the book.
Yeah, that's a really valid point, and I think you're right. Everyone's going to have their own experience they bring to it. My experience, clearly I'm bringing to it, and I write through that experience because I was in the village when she was shot, and so that experience, and then me just wrestling with who was she, and I also identify as a Christian, and she identified as Catholic, I identify as Protestant, and so wrestling with what does that mean, and I'm bringing all that context with me to her story. And so of course you're going to bring your experience and the people there, and I asked people, different Italians and different Somalis, whether in the diaspora or in Wajir and in Somaliland, I went to all these places. I asked them, what do you think about what she did? Would you call her a white savior? Those kind of ideas. And some people said, absolutely, she was a white savior. I don't know if it was right, what she did. Other people said, yeah, she saved my life. That makes her a white savior, and I'm really glad she did. And I wouldn't change a thing. And other people said, well, we didn't use that terminology. And so everybody kind of had their own way of coming to it. I don't have an answer, but I do know, I don't have an answer for how to live in the world. But I do know that the world I want to live in has people willing to do stuff like that if I'm the one in need. I want us to be able to partner. I want us to be able to, it's hard and it's complicated and we need to learn how to do it well and wisely. But I want to live in a world where we're able to, I don't know, step in somehow when we see something that needs doing, instead of just isolating and saying, it's not my business, or I can't solve it forever, so I'm not going to try now. But we have to be able to do that with ongoing growth and continuing to learn how to do it better from the people that we're helping, from people who are saying, hey, this is how I read your story or what you're saying. Think about these issues and let's do better.
Thank you. I'm gonna. Thank you for writing this book. I think we don't have to come to a conclusion about, a definitive conclusion about not only who she was or why she did it or if it was right or wrong. I think it is complicated. I think she lived at a different time period to now. I think some of the principles that have developed, like the do no harm principle and so on, could be sort of cowardly when there's disasters. But it could also be a safeguarding principle in which she wouldn't have been able to do some of the stuff that she did. But I think also we should not read it in isolation. We should read it in context of who she was and what she was trying to do. She was a nun who built multiple mosques in her compound to accommodate the people. And in return, they built her
they call that a hermitage, a prayer center. Yeah.
They built her in a Muslim community. They were like, you built us a mosque, we're going to build you a little room, 2-story, so that you could go and do your worship. And it's still there today?
Yeah, it's still there. I was able to go and see it.
So I think that on balance, and I'd love to hear it from everybody else as well, I think some learning can be done, but if nothing else, it is a very interesting read. So I'm going to open up for questions because I don't want to take up all the questions. Because so if anybody has questions, raise your hands. If nobody has, I have plenty.
I have an observation rather than a question. And my observation is one, if you do the context as she did, the lawyers back then in Italy, they were geared to be politicians and they have to have some experience in Africa. So no one forced her to stay first because she changed her life to adapt what she has seen or whatever changed her. Secondly, when you think the misery in there, one can either hold their hand and deal with it. But she didn't. She put in her hand wherever it was. So sometimes it's very difficult in getting that. Thirdly, when international agencies cut everything off from her, it's her family who supported her to stay and continue doing what she was doing. So I think it's a choice as a person making. And she moved me because I was in Italy. I followed everything that was said and how the people and everybody talk about when a person dies rather than acknowledging what they have in life. So I really, in contradiction, Sarah, to you, I feel that person made a conscious choice of living there as a person who dedicated her life. No one forced her. No theology forced her to do it because she was not a nun. And the word doctor comes from dottore. People are, anyone who graduates from university like me, Jama here in Italy, they gain that title, dottore. By abbreviation, afterwards, it becomes DR. And then DR, is it PhD, is medical, we don't know. But she earned that title once she graduated from law school, which is a dottore in Italiano.
Thank you.
Doctor in law. So it is. So I'm trying to myth out of the people who might put her in a difficult position. She is really a hero to me, a person who believes what they do and who sacrificed and did almost pay her life to. No one, she was not above of people. She was eating what the people were eating. She never had a resort or paid off. So they give all the accolades after she died.
I also want to add, thank you for your comment. I want to add that her family did support her and they continue to. She started an organization in Italy called the Comitato, especially every October, which is the anniversary of her death. They do a lot of work, but even in the town in Italy, they weren't just focused on Somaliland. They funded her projects, but they also funded local projects. And so they have all over the town of Forli, they have these big barrels that are on almost every street corner, and they're for gathering used clothing or used children's toys or books and things like this. And then they either sell them or give them away for free. And then they use that funding for targeting the needy in Italy. But also, I want to also add that some of her, when the funding was cut, part of her legacy is that her local Somali, the people there, her partners continued the work. And so even right now, I don't know now, I last visited her tuberculosis clinic in 2018, and the two people running it were the two nurses who had been with her the night she was shot. And now they were in charge, and they are medically trained. And they were partnering with Edna Adden and different people locally, and also the deaf school is continuing to run, and it's run by Somalis. And so part of her legacy is that people did step in when she was not there anymore. And I think that's important. She didn't leave behind a real plan for succession, and that would have been helpful, I think, both in managing the finances of her project and in training staff. And so it took some years of really tumultuous years of figuring out how are we going to do this, but we want to do it with what's available in Somaliland specifically. In Wajir also, the schools continue, a deaf school. I'm not sure about the medical work. It's kind of gone down. Funding has been an issue there. And then in Somalia, it hasn't been able to continue because of the war.